Hello, it's Karen Burniston here with a Card Making with Dies video teaching how to make a Parcel pop-up magic card. The Parcel pop-up is a very generic die set. It makes a pop-up cardboard box or present, and then it has an extra mechanism that slides something up and out of the box as you open the card. It works great in a top fold card, but it also works great in a bottom fold card, and for those I like to add our flap and closure at the top to keep the card closed. Then, by using a clear front, you can watch all the action of the item coming up and out of the box as the card opens. Now, after making that Peekaboo Snowman card, I got to thinking that the Parcel pop-up would probably work great for magic cards, and was delighted to discover how well it works. So it's basically a self-sliding magic card because you don't have to pull the tab to make the color change. You do that by just opening the card. Now, every time I've made a magic card in the past, I've used an outline stamp, but we are a die cutting company, not a stamp company. So of course I wanted to see if I could get a similar effect using one of our animal dies. So I tried it first with this Thanksgiving card using the turkey from our Feathered Animals die set. So in the video today, I will teach it both ways. I'm going to make one magic card that features one of our animals. So it's the penguin from our Winter Animals die set. If you're not much into stamping and coloring, this could be a good option for you because it is the paper that creates the colored version. However, you have to be willing to trace your image onto the transparency using a permanent marker, so that takes a little bit of a steady hand. Which brings us to the more traditional way of making a magic card, which would be to use an outline stamp. So this little cute penguin making a snow angel is from Riley & Company. And I do love the way that stamped magic cards work because, of course, there's no dimension to the one that you've colored in, so the transparency one really disappears. Okay, so first up, I'll work on the stamping. I'll start with a piece of white cardstock that is 2 1/8 by 4 1/4. The Parcel pop-up is going to create a frame for that stamp that's about 2 by 2. So when choosing a stamp, choose one that's no more than about 1 3/4 inches tall. You can go, of course, up to the full width of 2 inches. And I chose this cute Percy Snow Angel stamp from Riley & Company. Since I plan to color with Copics, I'll use a Copic-friendly ink, this Memento Tuxedo Black. I've got my cardstock put into my mini Misti stamp positioner. You don't have to use a stamp positioner, but I do like it because then, of course, I can stamp it twice if I missed any spots. This is not a coloring video. I would not be the one you would want to learn that from, but I did use my Copic markers and just colored in Percy. For transparency, I usually just use write-on transparencies. You could also use printer transparencies, just a thin, clear material. If you are using a stamp positioner, then you can just cut the transparency to the same size as the cardstock and stamp it in the exact same position. Now I'll have to switch to using stays-on ink because I'm stamping on a piece of plastic. And of course, a benefit of using a stamp positioner is that you are able to stamp that twice if you need to, but also for this technique that you're getting the transparency image in the exact same spot as the cardstock image, so now it's just ready to attach. But you do not have to own a stamp positioner to make a magic card. I would use a bigger piece of transparency if I were stamping using an acrylic block. And that way, after stamping, I can line that up over my cardstock version and then just trim off the excess. Now, since I'm planning on shaping my piece of cardstock as a tag later, my thought was that I would just use a strong glue dot up in the center where the hole protector is going to cover it later. And I want to make sure that the transparency version is exactly over the top of the cardstock version. And once it lines up perfectly, then I can press those two together. Then I'll just put that piece on my trimmer and trim away the excess transparency. Now that step would not be needed if you had already cut the transparency to perfectly fit and used the stamp positioner. So that's the basis of a magic card, that you have a transparency version over a version that's been colored in. Then you have a piece of blank cardstock in the middle. And the trick is that cardstock goes down or the image goes up, whichever way you want to think about it, but in any case it makes it look like the item magically turns to color. Okay, so now let me do the same thing, but this time I'm going to make my penguin by die cutting. Okay, so I've already cut and assembled my little penguin from the Winter Animals, and there is an assembly video on that die set if you need it. And then I just want to securely glue down that penguin right in the middle of my cardstock. Then I cut a piece of that same Write-On transparency, bigger than the cardstock. And since I'm going to have to do my own tracing, I want to make sure that I use some temporary tape and really secure down the transparency over the top of the cardstock so that it doesn't move while I'm tracing. I have a fine tip black Sharpie because I do need a permanent marker for doing this tracing since I'm going right onto the transparency. Now, through the magic of video editing, I have sped up the footage of me doing this tracing, but really I went quite slow on this and went over each section a couple of times to get a good dark black image on the outline trace. You can see how it's coming along. And even with a steady hand, it's going to be slightly imperfect because it's traced on there, but I still think it makes a really cool effect, and it's a good alternative when either you don't have a good stamp handy to do this effect or you just want to do it with dies. Okay, so then the same thing, glue dot at the top to attach them and trim the edges to fit. But then I noticed with the single glue dot, I felt like it was too easy for my penguins to slide out of alignment. So I went ahead and added some strong tape at the top as well. I knew I was going to be adding a ribbon. This would just dictate where my ribbon would go. Riley & Company also has their Funny Bones line, which has some really hilarious greetings. This one says, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all some good wine." I noticed that the tiny little Merry Christmas at the top would be perfect for my penguin cards, so I went ahead and stamped those onto white cardstock and then fussy cut them out. Now, if I had planned ahead, I could have just stamped them directly on the white cardstock above the penguins, but this just worked in a pinch, so it was fine. For a card base, I started with a piece of cardstock 4 1/4 inches wide by 7 3/4 inches tall, and then I scored it at 1.5 inches and 6 1/2 inches from the top. The flap die from the flap enclosure set can be used to just die cut a flap and glue it on using the tab that's attached to that piece. But if your card is narrow enough to fit through the die, then you can skip the step of gluing it on and only cut the flap itself by just weaving the cardstock through the die so that only the edge you want is going to cut. And I can do that same trick with one of the dies from our Border Blends Argyle set that does the little small scallop. The die is wider than the card, so I can actually weave the card through the die and cut just a single scalloped edge out on the end. You can use any die cutting machine that can accommodate a wafer thin die, and today I used my Spellbinders Platinum 6. Okay, so that is how I created my bottom fold card that has at least 1 inch at the bottom to hide the pop-up inside. And to that flap at the bottom, I want to add my thicker clear plastic. So I like to use the Graphics plastic in a 0.02, but you could check also at your local craft store. Maybe they just have it by the sheet. Since I can really see that tape shining through the plastic, I decided to disguise it by putting another piece of the cardstock on the front of the card, and I cut the edge with the same scallop. So then if I just line it up and glue it to the front of the card, it will disguise all of that tape that I could see through the plastic. And then to the inside of the card, I added patterned paper. I buy thin, strong magnets from K&J Magnetics, and I will put the link in the supply section below. So what I have is some glue dots, and I've got a magnet with a glue dot on it. But where I want it to go is actually on the underside of the plastic. So I'm going to tuck my blue cardstock flap to the inside of the card and use it as a guide to figure out where the magnet should go on the underside of the plastic so that it will overlap the flap when the flap goes back to the outside again. Okay, I have 2 more magnets just in case I need them, but I'm going to start with just one. So letting that stick to the magnet below, then I'll add my glue dot on top of that magnet. So right now the only thing that's holding it on there is that it's just stuck to the magnet that's underneath the plastic. Now if I put my flap down, it'll pick that magnet up and move it to the other side. And then to hide that magnet, I can use the decorative piece that comes in the flap enclosure die set and just glue it to the inside of the card. I die cut snowflakes out of patterned paper and used it on both sides to cover the magnet on the plastic. Then I made another card using different materials, and this time the magnet's not quite enough, the 2 magnets. So that's what I'm going to use magnet number 3 for. So I want to test that before I've put the decorative piece on the front of the card so I can add a 3rd magnet if I need it. Now the darker blue card is working great, but I'll just go ahead and add the magnet anyway because it could be that once I put the pop-up inside, it'll need a little bit more strength. The flap enclosure die set also comes with washers for the closures, and those work great as hole protectors when you're making tags. And then my favorite way to do the corners of tags is just to cut one by hand and then flip that corner over and use it basically as a template on the other side to make it match. Since I'm making 2 cards, I can just use my first tag as a template for my second one. Okay, time to make the parcel pop-up. First thing I'm going to do is cut frames. So I'm using the big stitch square and then the plain square that's a little bit smaller, nested those together, taped them together so they wouldn't move, and then cut the frames. And then for each card, I also need 1 white stitched square. To attach the frame to the square, I want to use foam tape just up the sides. So peeling the liner up off of the foam tape, I just want to line up the frame over the square, make sure that everything matches perfectly, and then attach those pieces together. Okay, grabbing my tag, what I want to do is get the transparency sliding through the frame and then out the other end. That way I can slide it down until I like the positioning of my penguin in the closed position. And I'm generally centering it, but also trying to disguise as much of Merry Christmas as I can. And you can see that the transparency is going to hit the bottom of the frame if I don't trim it off. So my first step, once I found a location I like, is to reach in with my permanent Sharpie pen there and just put a little pen mark on the transparency at the location that I want to cut it. Now I only want to cut the transparency down right now. I will have to trim the white tag, but it is going to be longer than the transparency. So for now, I want to just get the white tag out of the way while I trim the transparency down to where the edge of the transparency when the card is closed is just going to rest against that frame at the bottom. And I already trimmed down the transparency on my stamped version, so doing the same process. Okay, this is what I'm looking to make for each card. It's the parcel pop-up. To make that, I need to die cut 3 pieces. So the one that's the slider arm mechanism has been scored on the side in 2 locations and then along the long arm in 2 locations. So I want to find all those score lines. So basically just above and below that kind of wider part of the slider arm, there are score lines. So I want to work those. That one's a valley. And then the one that's above the little bit wider part is a mountain fold. And then what I have is the main 3-part slider arm, which has in it a mountain and then a valley fold. And then I've got these 2 reinforcing tabs. Now on the back of the piece, I want to glue down my upper reinforcing tab. So this one here can just get glue everywhere, fold it over, pinch it, or you can even just clip it so that you don't have to pinch it. But we're not going to glue down the other one just yet. I'm going to switch instead to my main pop-up part. And then what this slider arm is going to do is I want to get it through this section of the pop-up right here. So I bring the slider arm through, and then you'll see that you have notches in the slider arm, you have notches in the pop-up piece, and on the pop-up piece, which is the blue one, I want to carefully stretch that notch around so that I can trap the slider arm notches in the notches of the pop-up piece. So the white slider arm already knows how to fold because I've already worked those folds. That one's a mountain. That'll bring that down flat on the front. And then on the back, it'll be going the other direction. And then I have that valley fold, which brings the long piece down. So you can see how it's going to kind of accordion fold down into its flat position. Now I still haven't glued down my reinforcing tab on that long piece because as I do it, I want to trap that little blue tab in between the layers. Now right now these 2 do not match up, but they will as soon as I work the folds in the pop-up piece. So I get my thumbs underneath those skinny parts and I work those folds and then they fold the other direction as a mountain there. So that's basically making the pop-up box. So see, it's just 2 folds. And in the flat position, then now when I look on the back and I flatten down my white slider arm, it's brought that little blue tab up next to it so that as I glue down my reinforcing tab on the white piece, I'm actually able to trap in the blue tab in between the layers. So keeping everything nice and flat and straight, then I'm just going to fold over the blue tab and into that glue. And then I fold the white one right around it. And you can see there's a little bit of the blue tab still showing. That's fine. It just needs to be flat So it doesn't matter if the entire blue tab is trapped in there, it just matters that it can fold flat. And I can even clip that now to kind of give it a second to set up. Okay, removing my clip, I have now made my pop-up. I'm just missing one fold, and it's the fold on the blue piece right here. That defines the bottom of the box. So I want to fold that one as a mountain. And now I have created that pop-up with that extra mechanism behind it. It's kind of hard to see how it works before it gets in the card, but basically this little section up here is going to slide up as the card opens. That's where you would want to add this rectangle. There's also a thinner rectangle in the set. You can use either of them. But the glue should just go on the slider arm only in the area above the fold. So that little rectangle out on the end is going to get the adhesive, and then this one is going to line up at the top. So I'm just centering it and lining it up at the top. And I want the tail of that rectangle tucked down into the box. So if it's in front of the box, make sure that you lift it and tuck it into the box so that as everything closes, it slides down into the box. Then as the card opens, it'll come up and out of the box. So adhesive all over the front of my pop-up, and then I'm going to add my square to it. Since I have foam tape in my square, then I definitely want to be a little bit higher than the fold at the bottom. That gives it room to fold down. And I'm just centering it. Since I used the stitched square, it's not going to be quite as wide as the pop-up, so there'll be a little bit of the pop-up showing on both sides. It is good practice with the parcel pop-up to just take care of a potential catch point now, and it's this edge right here, where the pop-up is on the back of the box. Depending on what you put on your slider arm, it could come down and catch against that edge. I do not believe our white tags will ever get high enough that they could catch against that edge, but just a good practice to add some tape there, smooths it out, and then it can't catch your item. Okay, for smooth operation, you really don't want your back item, whatever's attached to the slider arm, to go any lower than the little rectangle itself. So I'm looking in the closed position at where that rectangle ends, and then I'm just measuring up to where that inside edge of the frame is, because I know that's where my transparency ends. And that distance is a 1/2 inch for me. So what that means is I need the white tag to be a 1/2 inch longer than the transparency. So I put the edge of the transparency at a 1/2 inch and I cut through the white tag. And I do that on both of them. But I wanted to show how I calculated it, just in case you've made a different choice. Maybe you're using the bigger, square to make your frame or something. So just measure from where you know your transparency ends to the end of that sliding rectangle in the closed position. Okay, so putting everything in and just checking it now, I can see as I close it down that I'm fine. I'm actually above the edge of that sliding rectangle. It looks like I probably could have even used like a 5/8 of an inch, but the 1/2 inch will work just fine. So the white tag is going to attach to that sliding rectangle, so I need to add glue to it. But then I have to be a little careful here because I want that sticky sliding rectangle to stay away from my tag until I get all the way down into the closed position. So I have to get the transparency into the frame, then I slide the transparency down until it's right on the edge of the frame. That's my closed position. Then pinch those so nothing moves, and now I've got to get the pop-up into its closed position. Trying to keep everything straight, just taking my time with this. Once it's in its completely flat and closed position, then I can make sure that that rectangle presses to the back of the tag. Okay, adding the parcel pop-up inside the card is just normal assembly. So the adhesive goes all over the base of the pop-up, and then I want to flip that face down and make sure that the ends of that pop-up are right in the fold of the card. Now that can go anywhere along the fold, but I'm just centering it today, so you can see how it's going to look. Just make sure that that's all pressed down really well. For the upper part of the pop-up, the adhesive needs to avoid all the center section because that's where the slider arm is, but can go out on the outside edges like that. And then close the other half of the card against it. And then just take your time to make sure that you give it enough time to set up. And I do like to kind of go slowly the first time. It could be that a little section isn't glued down or something. I can reach in there and pinch it as I open it that first time. But you can see now that the opening of the card performs the magic. And that will be the exact same process for the stamped version. So just doing exactly what I did with the die cut version, just making sure that the slider arm is attached to the tag, then getting it centered and put in my card, add my adhesive to the other side, close the card, give it time to set up, and then watch the magic. And now everything left is just optional decorations. So I did a little decoration up here on the front of the flap, some twine and some beads and jingle bells. And then for decorative pieces, I went with a large snowflake from our winter charms and then the binder clip from our office charms. And that paper clip on the front is also coming from the office charms. And then whatever item I put on the front of the plastic, I put a matching item on the back, and that way I didn't have to worry about adhesive showing. I did not spare the snowflakes on my other card, the one with the stamped penguin. And in fact, a snowflake is what's being used on the edge of the frame to disguise the M of Merry Christmas. And I wanted to have a little bit of red on the card when it was closed as well. So on the top flap, I added winter greetings from our word set 3. All of the magic cards that I have been making with the Parcel pop-up measure 4 1/4 by 5 inches when closed, which makes them mail nicely in an A2 envelope. And I love this technique, both with using stamps and also with using our die-cut animals. I think it works great either way. If you check the description box below this YouTube video, you will find all of the supply links as well as a link to the blog post, which is just a really good spot to see all of the pictures and information. Thanks for watching. If you click on the website link, you'll go to KarenBurniston.com, where you can find out information about purchasing these dies as well as links to all my other social media accounts. You can subscribe to this YouTube channel and check out some of my other videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.